Hi, my name is Juliet Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote. This podcast has been brought to you by the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. To learn more, visit www.thecgo.org. Today I will be speaking with Bryan Caplan. Bryan is a professor of economics at George Mason University and a regular blogger at EconLog. It is particularly great to be interviewing Bryan today because, as my mom tells me, Bryan knew me before I was even born. Welcome, Bryan.
It is so fantastic to be here, Julia. Thanks for having me.
Today I wanted to talk to you about your most recent book, a nonfiction graphic novel about immigration called Open Borders: The Science and Ethics of Immigration. But before we do, I want to ask you a question I ask all my guests. What is the most important thing that people my age or people in my generation should know, but we don't?
Yeah, so I think I'm just going to stay true to the theme of the book. And what I think the most important thing that people of your generation and really any generation generally fail to know is that there are enormous opportunities from liberalizing immigration. Right now, we're trapping billions of people in countries where they can't make use of their talents. And if we would liberalize immigration policy, they could not only make a better life for themselves, but they could share their abundance that they'll be able to make with us.
That sounds like exactly what we're about to be talking about. So let's start.
Okay.
So about the book itself. First, I wanted to ask you why you would want to write a comic book as opposed to a book about immigration. You've written 3 books before, but they're nothing like this one.
Yeah. So it really came about because I started reading a lot of books in this genre, nonfiction graphic novels. Just to back up. Of course, most movies are fiction, but some are nonfiction, some are documentaries. And similarly, most comic books are fiction, but some are nonfiction. And when I was reading them, I noticed that the best ones of them, most notably the Larry Gonnick's Cartoon History of the Universe, are just able to provide an extremely large amount of information in a very short amount of time because the right picture really is worth 1,000 words, as the saying goes. So you can get a lot more information provided to the reader per minute by using this format. But secondly, it's also more entertaining, and so you get more minutes of people's attention. So basically, if you multiply more information per minute times more minutes of attention, I at least was hoping that I could just teach people a lot more in a short amount of time. And based on the reaction, people have generally been really enthusiastic. This is my best reviewed book ever. And so
Wow.
I so anyway, and then like the other thing is that I just enjoy these books so much. I said, hey, I want to try something different. I want to try it. What'll happen? And I was able to pull it off. So there's also that personal element of just wanting to do something different and new and fun. But my main rationale is just that I think it's just a better way of teaching people about research and especially popularizing ideas that otherwise, for all their value, would just be too dry for most people to pay any attention to.
Did you also write this book in an effort to kind of draw in kids my age or like teenagers
Yeah,
into
definitely. Actually, I wanted to go to kids much younger than you, and I got a lot of reason I think I succeeded. So this is the only book that I ever wrote where my 5-year-old was reading it over my shoulder when I wrote it. So like I know quite a few kids of like 7 years old who have read the whole book, and I don't think that they understood all of it, but I think that they got a lot out of it. So yeah, I like to talk to teenagers, but even younger kids, and just get a book that people can pass around and it's like talk to people when they're still ready to change their minds. Yeah, so that was a lot of what I was really happy to do. And, especially I didn't want to dumb things down. I still wanted to have high standards. I didn't want to say it's just a comic book so I can make stuff up. Tried to research it carefully, just like I would with anything else, but then to just make it better for the reader.
The drawings. I really like the drawings. What are some challenges that you faced in kind of communicating your ideas with the illustrator of the book?
Wow. So the illustrator is famed web comic artist Zach Wienersmith, and it wasn't hard to communicate anything to him because he's so awesome. The way that I did it is I actually used Google Images to storyboard the book. So I've got these very rough storyboards that I set out using some old comic software. And then once I had a picture, like I might have a picture of planet Earth, and then I put little notes to the artist about how to modify or tweak the original visual image because I rarely could find exactly what I was looking for. And then he would go and draw a rough draft, which in the biz they call a pencil, although it's all digital, so there's no real pencils anymore. But it's called a pencil. And then he would send me these rough pencils, and then I would go and tell him exactly what was not whatever was not exactly the way I wanted it, and then he would revise it. And I give him more comments, and we go back and forth. Sometimes he would tell me that my visuals wouldn't work for reasons that were obvious to an artist but not to me. Things like you can't squeeze a crowd scene into a panel that small. People won't be able to tell what's going on. So, I mean, he gave me lots of great advice like that, actually. But, I mean, just in terms of collaboration, this was the best one of my life. Zach taught me lots of new skills. And it was, the only bad thing about finishing the book is I don't talk to Zach every day anymore.
Well, that's great to hear. That's really cool. So before diving into each chapter of the book, I kind of wanted to talk about the general theme.
Mm-hmm.
So it's called Open Borders, and I assume by that you mean the ability of people to move around freely, not just across state borders, but not just within the country, but also across country borders. Is that what you have in mind?
Yeah, yeah. So,
How many barriers how much, like, to what extent of barriers, like what would you be able to tolerate?
right. I mean, in terms of what I would be able to tolerate, I guess I tolerate what we have right now. I'm not running around like a chicken with my head cut off. What choice do I have? But like in terms of what open borders means, like in slogan form, I like to say it just means that people are free to live and work in any country on Earth. Right now, would it still be open borders if you had to show papers at the border or anything like that? And I would say, yeah, basically, you realize like 99.99% open. It's not a big deal. The big deal comes when you start imposing extra restrictions on people based upon their country of birth. So, once you're in a situation where natives are allowed to work and foreigners can't, or natives are allowed to travel around but foreigners can't, or natives can live where they want but foreigners can't. That's where I think of drawing the line. Although again, like what I explained in the book is, like while like I am arguing for something very radical, I'm also very happy to get even moderate reforms in my direction. And again, especially if it's a matter of someone agrees 95%, then I don't see the point of saying, well, like the last 5%, like if you don't agree with me on everything, then sorry, you can take a hike.
So what's the humanitarian case for open borders and what's the economic case?
Yeah. So the humanitarian case is the one that most people have in their minds, and it comes down to there are miserable, poor, starving people, people in other countries. They're fleeing from wars. They're in danger for their lives. And wouldn't it be nice if we let them in? And attached to that is the idea of, look, obviously it's going to cost some money to go and let in a bunch of people, but can we just be kind? Can we just be open-hearted about it? So this is an idea which, again, I don't think is wrong, but it's one where it's missing so much because it's really focusing on the small number of migrants who would not be able to take care of themselves in a first world country, when like a large majority can. So and it's acting like, say, like a starving orphan is the norm for people that want to move, and that's just not the norm at all. That's just a tiny minority. The economic case, on the other hand, says that what migration barriers do is trap human talent in places where it's not very productive. So the reason why people want to go from one country to another is usually to make more money. The reason why you make more money in one place than another is because you're more productive. You produce more stuff. This is really obvious for something like agriculture, where you go and move Mexican farmers who are working with farm animals and primitive tools out in rural Mexico. And when you let them into the US, suddenly they could easily be growing 10 or 100 times as much food per person because conditions here are so much better in so many ways, not just technologically, just in terms of management is much better. Just research on management, and first world countries just have better management. The firms are organized more effectively than in poor countries. And what this means is that by allowing, say, Mexican farm workers to come, of course, you're letting them have a better life, and the humanitarians are right about that. But this does not mean they're going to be a burden on anyone in this country. Rather, quite the opposite. It means that they are going to be producing more stuff, which then ultimately gets sold to people here, and we're their customers. Right? So that's really the heart of the economic case, just saying that when you let people move, this increases the production of mankind. So just to clarify, it's obvious that when you move Mexicans to the U.S., we've got more production, they've got less because people do something. But I'm saying something much more important than that. What I'm saying is that when you move Mexicans to the U.S., the total production of Mexico plus the U.S. goes up because the Mexicans accomplish more in the U.S. than they could accomplish at home, which is then good for both them and us and the world.
Aren't you worried, though, that everyone will want to come to the US and then there will be problems because everyone is in the US?
I'd be worried if everyone came tomorrow or today, right? Because then they'd be sleeping in the streets and the roads would be clogged and we'd starve because we wouldn't be able to drive anywhere anymore. So, I mean, seriously, if you do the thought experiment of put 1 billion people in the U.S., people would be clogging the streets and it would be a total disaster. However, I'm not worried because we have a lot of historical experience when borders get opened. Not nearly as much as I would like, but still, we've got multiple cases. And what we can see is that initially the amount of movement is very high compared to what we think of as high now, but it's still nowhere near enough to go and clog the streets or cause any severe social disruption like that. And then what we normally see is that immigration gradually snowballs. So once you open up a border between two countries that's previously been totally closed, it starts off with a moderate amount, and then it builds and builds and builds. And and eventually, I think you would get over 1 billion people coming to the U.S., but probably that's going to take at least 50 years. In terms of like past examples that I'm talking about, my favorite one, which has a couple pages in the book, is Puerto Rico. So in 1902, there's a U.S. Supreme Court case that opens the border with Puerto Rico. The first decade after that opening, only a few thousand Puerto Ricans come. And you might say, well, Puerto Ricans just don't want to move to the U.S., so that's how it is. And they don't like the climate or whatever. But then you can see the next decade, a lot more come, and then a lot more come. And then there's the Great Depression, hardly anyone comes then, but that's unrelated, right? Or a separate factor. And then in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, there is an enormous amount of Puerto Rican immigration. And the story is this. People do not like to be the first person from their country to move to another country. It's very scary. You're alone. You probably don't know one will speak your language. But once a few people do that, then there's some other people who are also very brave, but not quite as brave as the first group, and they come, and then the next group comes, the next group comes. And so in the long run, you should expect an enormous amount of migration. But this is a time frame where there's plenty of time to go and build new housing, to build new factories, new industries. And again, this is what has happened in the past, and every reason to think it would happen again. I mean, just like another interesting historical example. So, imagine saying in 1930 that we're going to move from a world where 20% of adult women work to one where 70% of adult women work. People at the time would have said that'll be a total disaster. Where will all the women go? Where will they fit? How will they get where they're going if we increase traffic by 50% overnight? And these are actually reasonable questions if you imagine a change of that magnitude happening in a day. But if you spread it out over decades, you barely notice. And then that's, of course, another case where you had a lot of human talent that was being wasted. And by having a system where things can change, you take a lot of female talent that otherwise would have been doing very little at home, and allow both genders to have careers and contribute to the world. And we've got to reap the bounty of this for many decades now.
So, while I understand the value of immigrants, and as you've explained, um, well, I mean, you can see there's this lady that took care of me and my sister for years, and
Mm-hmm.
she's still in our lives, and she's from Bolivia. My mom is from France, but my dad was American.
Mm-hmm.
He came from Europe at some point, like his family, his ancestors. The same is true for the majority of Americans.
Mm-hmm.
Yet, I find difficulty in responding to those who oppose immigration because I'm lacking the proper statistics, the proper arguments.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of what your book looks at
Mm-hmm.
for a good portion of it. So let's review some of these arguments.
Sure.
Many people kind of argue that natives of a country that people are immigrating to carry the burden of this immigration. The argument is that low skill immigrants don't make that much money, but they're a big drain to the entire country on public services and government programs. So this is often talked about, especially when talking about illegal immigrants. How can you respond to this argument?
Let's see. So let's start with the illegal immigrants first. Illegal immigrants are eligible for almost no government benefits. So they're actually one of the best deals for U.S. taxpayers around. But I mean, the more general point, this is a question where so many people have opinions who have never looked at any numbers at all. And to me, like forming an opinion about the net fiscal effect of an immigrant when you've never looked at any numbers on taxes or benefits or anything else, I am just baffled that the people think they can do this kind of math in their heads. So anyway, what I did in this book is I tried to find the most boring, driest estimates of the amount of taxes that immigrants of different skill levels pay, the amount of benefits that they use. So again, I'm not someone that I just went and tried to find some expert who agreed with me. And I definitely didn't do this work myself. Instead, I tried to do a search for what has been done by people who don't seem to have any dog in the fight. And and I did find that recently there was a very careful National Academy of Sciences report trying to measure this. And you need to understand what you're doing here. So if you want to figure out whether immigrants are a fiscal burden on native taxpayers, you want to figure out two things. So first of all, of course, you need to know what's the cost of all the services that the immigrants are going to consume. We also need to know what are all the taxes that we're going to pay. Then you've got to figure this out over a long time horizon, because, for example, an immigrant might show up and they don't have any kids, but then they have kids a few years later, and then that burdens taxpayers. And if you did it the day they arrive, then could get a very unfair estimate, an unfairly optimistic estimate of immigration. But then once you're figuring in, well, the education of their kids, then you need to figure in the taxes that their kids will eventually pay and the benefits they'll eventually consume. Anyway, this is extremely involved, very hard, very, very arithmetic. And the answer that you get, or the answer that people that have worked on this for many years come up with, is that for current immigrants to the U.S., they are a net fiscal positive. They actually, on average, are paying more in taxes than they are using up in benefits, right? If this seems very hard to believe, there's a few key factors that at least help you realize why these numbers could work. So one of them is that a lot of government services are what we call non-rival, meaning that the cost does not depend on population. So, if we had a new baby boom, no one would say we need to get more nuclear weapons to defend the babies. Right. So similarly, you can let in a bunch of more immigrants, and rather than this, meaning that you now need to spend more on protecting them, it means that you have some more people to spread the cost around. So there's that, right? So that's one important thing. So then another one is to realize that so much of the cost of government services, when you add up all levels, state, local, federal, is coming from education. And when you get adult immigrants, you basically get to avoid paying really anything for their education. So it's true that their kids are likely to go to school, but when you have a family of two native parents and one native-born kid, then U.S. taxpayers pay for all three educations. If you have a family of two adult immigrants and their kid, then U.S. taxpayers only pay for one education. So that's another really big savings that you get from immigrants. But then, lurking most importantly in the background probably is that when you really look at the budget, most of the government budget is spent not on the poor, but on the old, right? So, of course, there are expensive programs for the poor too, but we spend a lot more on the old than on the poor, and immigrants tend to be young. So this means that even when you have young, low-skilled immigrants, the same math says that they are actually going to be fiscal positives on average, right? So again, now, if someone is disinclined to or is inclined to disagree, I would have to think that they're not going to put much trust in me. But would you trust the National Academy of Sciences? So in my book, I did try to make the documentation very clear, so the reader can double check what I'm saying. This is all right. All these reports are right on the internet. And again, they're not from people that are pushing any radical agenda. They're just doing the math. Now, the deeper question, of course, is fine, maybe right now immigrants are a net positive, but under open borders, will they still be a net positive? And it's true that under open borders, you'd be allowed to have a lot more. There'd be a lot more low-skilled immigration because that's the group where it's hardest for them to get permission to come legally right now. But still, what I would say is that there is good evidence that even low-skilled immigrants are net positive as long as they're young, right? And again, people who move from one country to another, they tend to be young. It's something that old people don't like doing. So you put it all together, and I think this argument, while it's not crazy, and again, it does vary a bit by country. So there's sort of a more general set of research on is a new native born baby a net fiscal positive or not, and the usual answer is yes, except in Saudi Arabia. Right? Because in Saudi Arabia and countries like that, like a native born, a citizen baby immediately, automatically gets a cut of the oil money. And since there's this fixed stock of oil, in Saudi Arabia, a baby actually is almost literally a drain on the resources because that baby gets to suck up some oil. But it's really weird countries like that where citizens are given a giant pile of natural resources effectively just for being born. But in the rest of the world, the tax system doesn't work that way, and also the welfare state doesn't work that way. So, it's in the same way that new babies are actually a fiscal positive, immigrants are fiscal positive. The one big difference is just that adult immigrants, you get to skip out on paying for their education. So that's a great deal for natives.
So, what about security? People say things like, if we had lax immigration laws, terrorists and murderers would be able to come here and freely attack us from the inside. What do you say to those people?
Yeah, so of course it's a very emotional issue, and I always just try to defuse the situation first because I know people are going to be very upset. But ultimately, what I say is, terrorism is actually an extremely small issue that's highly emotionally affecting, but it's not really very important in the broad scheme of things. So in Open Borders, I go over the actual numbers on murders from terrorism versus other murders versus other causes of death. It basically comes down to terrorism is less than 1% of all murders, murders less than 1% of all deaths. So we really are making a huge deal out of something that is sad, but it's a very minor problem. Now, of course, there is the story that the only reason why we don't have a lot of terrorism is because of all the border control measures. This story just does not make a lot of sense for the simple reason that right now it's not that hard for someone to get, it would be terrorists to get into Mexico. And as we know, it's not that hard for someone to get from Mexico to the U.S. And now, when I say that, by the way, so what I mean is that the cost of getting smuggled from Mexico to the U.S. is usually like $3,000 to $5,000. That's a lot for a Mexican farmer, but it's not a lot for a determined terrorist, right? Or especially if you're part of a terrorist organization. So what I would say is that is actually in the current regime, at least the regime until a couple of months ago, if a terrorist wanted to get into the U.S., it's just not that hard. And since there's so little terrorism going on, the explanation is just not that many people are that motivated to do it. It's only a very tiny number of people on Earth want to kill themselves in order to kill a bunch of strangers. Fortunately, because when you think about it a bit more, it's super easy to do it, right? In Europe, there was a wave of vehicular rammings. And this is something where no one said let's ban cars in order to stop vehicular rammings. It's just something that you can go and punish people for doing, or you can try going and monitoring people that you think are suspicious. But ultimately, the good news is only about 10 people in Europe or so, 10, 20 had were willing to actually go and get in a car and try killing people, right? Which I know it's very scary, but it's the kind of scary of a television show rather than something that a sensible person would spend much time worrying about. So, and again, and for more ordinary crime, that's a much more reasonable worry than terrorism. terrorism is basically something that's only on TV. Actual violence, like depending upon where you're living, you may encounter that. Although, of course, even that's outside of most people's firsthand experience in the U.S. But anyway, so we've got that. We've also got good data to saying that foreign-born have lower crime rates than natives. So while of course some immigrants do go and commit crimes, it doesn't seem like it's at most an argument against humanity rather than an argument against immigration. So if the argument of we should stop having babies because they might grow up to be murderers doesn't make much sense to you, then I would say, let's keep immigrants out because they might be murderers. Also, doesn't make much sense. Well, of course, if you're really paranoid, there's that. Now, by the way, so once I actually was at the nation's main anti-immigration conference, brought in as the devil's advocate, right? Or I guess technically, since I believed it, I wouldn't really be a devil's advocate. But anyway, brought in as the lone voice of dissent. And later that day, they actually were featuring a panel of people whose relatives have been murdered by illegal immigrants, right? And if they'd asked me to be on that panel, I would have just said, no, I'm not going to be on that panel. Because while logically there are great things to say, like, well, you don't want to get rid of all the Jews just because there's one Jewish murderer. So why do you want to get rid of immigrants because there's an immigrant murderer? But of course, to someone who's had a family member murdered, none of that's going to matter. I mean, a couple of times people have said, what would you do if one of your children was murdered by an illegal immigrant? And I could just burst out in tears, but instead I try, or just say, how dare you ask such a question, sir? But I try to actually take the question honestly and to say, if that happened, I would try to see the individual that did it punished as harshly as he could be punished. And then I would do nothing else. I wouldn't go after that person's family. I wouldn't try to punish everyone from his country. I wouldn't go around saying that everyone from Bolivia is evil if a Bolivian murdered one of my children. I would just would I actually have the character to do it? I don't know, but we'd all know what a person of character would do.
Yeah, I mean, in your book, you said something about, are we gonna, like, if a redhead did something,
Yeah,
would we just get all the redheads out of our country? Well, no.
yeah, yeah. And I was lucky because the guy who did the Dark, or was the Dark Knight Rises murders? He was a redhead, so and he looked, and he was a great visual because he looked so weird. So,
So, politicians often use restriction of immigration as a blanket solution to many issues. Is there a better way to address them? And if we do, as you say, and open our borders, how do we fix those problems?
yeah. So in the book, I have a chapter on what are called keyhole solutions. The inspiration for this comes from modern surgery. So back in the bad old days, typical surgery would be like amputation, where amputation will get rid of gangrene. However, there are some bad side effects of amputation, like you lose a limb, right? And in modern surgery, they try to do what they call keyhole surgery, where they try to make the incision just big enough to deal with the problem in order to have a minimum of negative side effects and collateral damage and just suffering for the patient. And economic journalist Tim Harford suggested we should think about this for policy too. We should think about keyhole policies or keyhole solutions, where if there is some kind of social problem, that we should try, like if government's going to do something about it, it should try to figure out a way to handle the problem in the cheapest and most humane way instead of doing the policy equivalent of amputation. Now, for immigration, I went through a number of these. So, like for example, suppose that you're still worried about immigrants coming to the U.S. to be a burden on the welfare state. You could say, and the usual thing to say is, sorry, you can't come. We're too worried you're going to be a burden, right? But something very
Mhm.
different, much more constructive that you could say is, you can come, but you can't collect benefits. You're not eligible, right? Or you could even do things like you can come, but if you want to come, you first have to post a $5,000 bond, which coincidentally is about as much as it costs to get smuggled in from Mexico. So, right? Except here's this actually solves a problem instead of just allowing a person to get around to get around the law, right? And if you think that immigrants are going to vote the wrong way, you can say you can come, but you can't vote. If you're just worried about the effect on, say, low-skilled American workers, I say, well, you could let them in with an admission fee or a surtax, and then use that extra revenue to go and compensate natives that you think are losing from immigration. Or like if you think that the immigrants are going to not culturally fit in, then you could say, fine, you've got to go and pass a test of linguistic fluency if you want to get in. Now, I mean, as I say in the book, I'm not even advocating any of these. I'm just saying these are a lot better than what we do right now, right? And if they seem unfair, they do seem kind of unfair to me, but still a lot less unfair than saying you're not allowed in, right? So one thing that's very striking is that countries tend to view how they treat immigrants based upon how they treat the ones that they allow in, rather than how many they let in. They say, and obviously, if you're
Hmm.
trying to rate how nice you are to immigrants, both things are important, right? So the treatment per immigrant and the total number, right? So, there are some countries where they let in almost no one, but the ones that are there, they roll out the red carpet for them. All right. And then they feel really good about themselves. But so you let in 5 people and you bought them all homes, but that's only 5 people. On the other end, you could go to a country like Kuwait, where 85% of the population is foreign born. And in Kuwait, the treatment of immigrants that are there is generally not considered very good. So there's a lot of stores they're not allowed to shop at. There's various abuses with people taking their passports and so on. But they do keep coming, and it really is a way that someone from, say, Pakistan can work for 5 years and go home to his village a very rich man, right? And again, what's so great about the Kuwaiti immigration policy? They let the immigrants in. I mean, like the most absurd one is a country where the law says any immigrant who gets in, we give them $1 million, but that you let in 0 immigrants, right? And I say the countries that are really good, really good to immigrants, are the ones that just let people in to build a better life for themselves. And it's also surprising that countries where they don't give the immigrants very much let in so many, because it does diffuse this argument of they're here to burden us. In Kuwait, almost no one would look at an immigrant and say they're here to freeload. It's just too obvious that they're doing every hard, unpleasant job in the country to say that.
So you kind of like leave the rest up to them. You just let them in, and that's kind of how you just allow them to benefit from the
Yeah,
opportunities that we benefit from every day.
yeah,
So, to conclude, if you could only make one argument in favor for a more open border immigration system, and you didn't have much time to make this argument, what would it be? And on a related note, what advice would you give teenagers like me who want to make a better case for immigration to like adults or other kids?
yeah. So, I mean, I'm honestly, if I only had a short amount of time, I'd be tempted to just do the really emotional arguments. In terms of like actually changing policy, I think that famous photograph of the Syrian boy who drowned might have done more than every argument by every economist. So, like, that photograph might have saved millions of refugees from the horrors of the Syrian civil war. Um, however, like personally, I just don't want to be the person that gives the emotional arguments. So I think I would focus on the open borders would ultimately something like double the production of mankind, because you're wasting so much human talent in places where it's not very productive. And especially having to say, like, imagine, like, well, if you were stuck in Haiti, how productive would you be? Like, would it really be good for the world if we kept you stuck in Haiti just because you were born there? Does that make sense to you? Well, then why is it
No.
good to keep the Haitians stuck in Haiti just because they happen to be born there? Like, why wouldn't it be better for not only them but the world if they were just allowed to go? So I guess that's probably what I would focus on. I mean, and especially since there are so many other emotional arguments that are out there, and like I appreciate what people are doing there, but I think like the argument that I'm making is one that you hardly ever hear, and I think it's just so intellectually solid. I really want to make it. In terms of what to tell teenagers, let's see. So I just finished doing a book club on Dale Carnegie's classic book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. And I'll say, like,
Mhm.
I like this book not because I'm so good at this, but because I'm not good at it. And I know, but I know that I've improved a lot since I was a teenager. Because when I was a teenager, I was about as bad as you could possibly be. When I was a teenager, I was the most obnoxious loudmouth you're ever likely to have encountered. And when I look back at myself, I just do a face palm and say, "What was I thinking? Why did I act that way? Why did I talk to everyone like they were the scum of the earth? Why did I have this terrible attitude?" Right? And I have to say though, like, if I could just go back in time and talk to myself, I think I really could have improved myself a lot. And it would come down just to this, saying, look, when you talk to people like that, it really upsets them and they don't listen to you, right? And if you want people to listen to you, you need to be super friendly all the time to everyone, no matter how they're treating you. Just turn the other cheek. Even though I also, I didn't like being made to go to church, but still, like that lesson of, turn the other cheek, return kindness for cruelty. And this kind of thing, even if it doesn't work on the person that you're actually talking to, it works on the audience, right? When people, so like in a debate, when one person is screaming and the other one just keeps their cool and talks like a human being, it's very hard to take the side of the screamer. It's very hard to say, oh, that guy, the guy screaming, I like that guy, right? And, the lessons in Dale Carnegie are ones that you can apply very generally, but especially if you've got controversial ideas that are going to upset people, like you really have to bend over backwards to compensate by just being the most lovable person you can be. And again, like I said, I say this not because I hold myself up in it as an example, but I've learned a lot and I'm trying to improve, and it's totally doable. So, even things, things as simple as, as just don't tell a person you're wrong, right? Don't tell a person you're wrong. That's a way to make sure that they never listen to you, right? Instead, it's much more helpful for you to start out by saying, well, maybe I'm wrong, but here, this is the way that I've thought about it. So, well, like, what's about that isn't convincing to you, right? This way of talking to people, like I mean, is it highly effective? It's not, because nothing's highly effective, right? There's no known highly effective way of persuading anyone of anything that they don't really want to hear. But there are the methods that are almost guaranteed to fail, like telling people you're an idiot. And then there are the methods that have some moderate level of success by saying, well, gee, maybe I'm wrong, but here's how it seems to me. Well, like what's wrong with that exactly, right? And that's a way that it's one where people are more likely to keep talking to you. It's one where they feel like you listen to them. And by the way, like something that I felt really good about with Open Borders is that when I actually talk to people, when I actually do public speaking or debating, if I watch video of it, my expressions are wrong, right? My tone is wrong, right? I'm trying my best to be friendly and jovial all the time, but I'm just not. But in Open Borders, my expression and tone are always right. Because it's a cartoon. So, when Zach drew me, I was actually able to say, make me 3% happier in this picture. And he would really do it. Right. And when I was, and of course, even when you're just writing ordinary prose, you can try to change the tone. But when you can change the visuals, then you can change the way that the reader hears the words. Because when you're reading a comic, if the person is smiling, you hear the words differently than if they're frowning, right? And so in Open Borders, I was able to go and really nail my demeanor, to nail the tone, because it's all I had years to go and get it just right. But I mean, really, what you can see in that book is this is what I'm striving for when I talk to people, when I do debates, and whenever I give a talk. I want to be the guy in that book, even though I know I'm not.
Well, that's I mean, I feel like a lot of people have that goal, is to come off as like, just to have the right projection of what you mean and what you feel at all times. So, thank you so much, Bryan. I really enjoyed our conversation. There's so much more to your book, Open Borders, than what we discussed today. I really recommend it to everyone who's listening, just everyone in general. It will open up your mind about a very important issue, something that's widely discussed like all the time, and hopefully it will challenge what you think, and it will help you make better arguments and kind of to think about it. So thank you so much for speaking with me.
Oh, Julia, can we just do two other things?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
sure.
So one of them is just the pitch. So the book still ships on 2-day shipping for $13.99 or $13.39 on Amazon. So not only is it as accessible as before, but you got a lot more spare time in your hands, and always think of the children. So there's clearly some kids that need to read this book right now. What intellectual stimulation they're getting? Hardly any, right? But given this book, and kids will actually read this book. I know a bunch have. The other thing is, what can what does coronavirus mean for Open Borders? So When I wrote this book, almost no one was talking about immigration and infectious disease. And now, of course, I really wished I'd had a chapter on it, but hindsight's 2020. But here are the two main things to say. So, first of all, since right now borders are still almost totally closed, I'd say like 98% closed is a very reasonable measure. If you realize how hard it is for people to not only get in to live and work, but even tourists. Most people in the third world can never get a tourist visa in the U.S. because they can never prove to the U.S. government that they don't want to stay. Basically, you have to be quite rich if you like own a house and a bunch of other things before the U.S. government would even consider giving, say, a Guatemalan citizen a tourist visa. But anyway, we can say his borders are 98% closed, but this was nowhere near enough to stop the spread of the virus. And
Mm-hmm.
say, so what would you need to, how close would you have to be to stop the spread of the virus? So you'd have to get rid of not just immigration, you have to get rid of all tourism. You have to get rid of all tourism. And even that's not enough, because if you kept out all the tourists, your own citizens would still be able to leave the country, go to a place with the virus, get it, and come back and spread it. So in order to actually really be sealed off enough, you would have to actually have a closed society where no one gets in or out ever. And if that sounds crazy, it is. That's like North Korea or Albania under Enver Hoxha. Now, there is one positive thing that I will say that coronavirus shows us about open borders, and it's this. So right now, most countries in the world have almost totally have shut down their economies. Everything non-essential is gone. There's massive unemployment, and now here's the interesting thing: if we had always had the shutdown, if it had always been here, and then someone said, "Hey, let's end the shutdown and watch the enormous explosion of human productivity that we've been missing," people would say, "Oh, come on, that's ridiculous. You can't go and get this big explosion." And if you go and allow people to have sit-down restaurants, this will devastate takeout, and the grocery stores will be ruined. No. We got to keep the system of shutdown forever. Now, fortunately, no one is saying that right now, because we remember how the world used to be good, and it can and will get back to being good. In the case of open borders, I say we have an opportunity even more tremendous than ending the shutdown. The only difference is that we've never, or at least it's been 100 years since we've seen an open borders world. So we really just have totally lost any appreciation of what we're missing. But what we are missing is every bit as important, more important than all of the losses that we've seen in our lives in the last few months. So, if anything good can come out of this, it would be realizing that just as we are losing out an enormous amount by wasting human talent now, there is an enormous amount of human talent that is going to waste around the world every day when there's no problem with any contagion or anything else. And if we could just see that opportunity and act on it, we have a path to a vastly better world.
Nicely said. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's been great talking to you, Juliet.